Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this fifth session of the Date with Death Club. I'm so glad to see all of you here tonight and appreciate your being here. And I want to thank Lillian and Susan and the Adult Programs Committee for working with me on this and giving me the opportunity to do it. Tonight, as those of you who've been here before, we usually break people into groups and have discussion and come back with report outs. And tonight we thought we'd try something different, opening the floor for general discussion for a few times in the course of the meeting. So when there is one of those times, I want to ask you to please raise your hand. Does everybody know how to raise your hand? Let's try it. Go to reactions at the bottom of your screen. And oh, that's applause. Yeah, there you go. Everybody try it.
Yeah,
Okay.
looks good. I think most people found it. Yep.
Okay. And so for those of you who have been involved in the previous sessions, you know that we've been talking about death. And we have been recognizing the inevitability of death and getting comfortable talking about it and thinking about how to live more fully, knowing that we're not always going to be here. And we have talked about what is a good death in each of our picture, and how to make our wishes known to others about how we want to spend our last days. And tonight we're going to talk about the other side of that coin, dealing with the death of others and the grief that follows. We're going to talk about what grief is and what research says about it, about adjusting to life after loss, about the different kinds of grief, and finally, how to support others who are in the throes of grief. And as the title of the workshop suggests, grief is the natural response to the loss of love. And as we will talk about tonight, we will talk about what we can learn from the experiences of grief, in addition to how grief makes us feel. So I'm going to share my screen now, and the hardest part about doing this for me is managing the technology. And what I've learned today is when I share my screen and put my presentation in presentation mode, I can't see any of you or myself. So I'll be going kind of blind. Lillian will be able to see you, and she will be able to see your hands raised. And so she will call on you when the time comes. And I hope you will realize that I'm going blind. Okay. All right. So I'm sorry. Let me get my bearings here a little bit. So for people who haven't been here before, I want to say just a little bit about the Date with Death Club. It is considered a club. It's a multi-session curriculum developed by another UU minister. Her name was Dr. Susan Johnston. And the purpose of this whole curriculum is to support each other in confronting our own mortality. Because we know that doing that inspires us to add more life to the years that we have left and make that time more meaningful and more joyful. In the first session, again, we talked about getting comfortable talking about death and changing our negative attitudes about aging. And in the last session, we worked in groups to discuss our fears about death and dying and come up with ideas for making our fears less frightening. So in tonight's session, we're going to talk about definitions of grief and grief cycles. We're going to learn about disenfranchised grief and what that means, and talk about our own experiences with it, and discuss empathic ways to support others who are grieving. So this is the agenda for tonight. We'll have opportunities for large group discussions, as I mentioned at the beginning. I'm going to show a few short videos. I think there are two, and I hope they work with the technology. And we hope to have time at the end for a final discussion for anything that might have come up for you tonight. I know this is a heavy topic, and I hope we will be able to share our experiences with each other at the end. And we will close with a poem called Talking to Grief that Lillian will read. As usual, we'd like to be reminded that we're not here to give advice to each other or tell someone how to grieve or that there's a right way. We know that everyone grieves in their own way, in different ways. So we hope we can listen and learn from each other and try not to correct or suggest fixes for other people's experiences. For the first part of this session, we're going to be talking about grief per se, which the dictionary defines as deep and poignant distress caused by bereavement. These words are almost too painful to say. Sorrow, suffering, sadness, misery, anguish, heartbreak. For me, the word itself fills me with dread. And yet, this man, Francis Weller, has said that there's some strange intimacy between grief and aliveness, some sacred exchange between what seems unbearable and what is most exquisitely alive. And I wonder, this is one of those moments where I'd like to stop and ask you your reaction to that quotation. Does that make you crazy, or do you relate to that in some way? I'm going to wait and ask Lillian to see who's raising their hand and see if someone wants to talk about what that brings up for them. So we've started talking about grief and we haven't said much about bereavement. And as you see here, there are many definitions for both of these words, but it's fair to say that bereavement is the state of having lost a significant other to death, and grief is the personal response to that loss. It's said that grief is literally something that changes the brain. And there's a book out that describes this physical response to grief. It's called The Grieving Brain by Mary Frances O'Connor, if any of you are interested in that. Tonight, I want to show a short video that sort of boils this down a little bit. It's a little over 3 minutes, and I think it's very interesting. And I hope it works.
When we're grieving a profound loss, we often say we're heartbroken, but it might be more accurate to call it brain broken, given the role the brain plays in grief. As your brain adjusts to the loss of someone you love, you might feel numb, depressed, or foggy. But moving through the stages of grief is natural and healthy. It helps you process your loss and begin to move forward over time. This is Your Brain On, where we explore how the world affects our brains and ourselves. The experience of grief is twofold: the immediate acute pain of the loss, and the months afterward as you mourn. The loss of someone meaningful functions as a stressor, triggering the pituitary gland at the base of the brain to produce adrenocorticotrophin, or ACTH. ACTH sends a signal to the adrenal gland to release cortisone, a stress hormone. Unlike, say, a temporary threat, grief is an intense, persistent stressor, so your body remains flooded with cortisone. That can cause your immune system to falter, making you feel run down. This is likely why some bereaved spouses fall ill soon after their partner dies. Even if the death of your loved one was expected, the actual event can still feel like a shock to the system. In the short term, a traumatized brain is bottom-heavy, meaning primitive areas, including the fear center, are overactive, adding to feelings of stress and despair. Meanwhile, higher cortical areas of the brain are underactive, like the anterior cingulate cortex, which helps regulate emotion. You may find it difficult to let go of minor annoyances or experience symptoms like increased heart rate for several minutes after you're startled. However, over time, the initial shock of the loss typically gives way to a deep sadness or depression as you continue to mourn. Depression can cause widespread changes across several parts of the brain, including the amygdala, which regulates sleep behavior and mood, and the hippocampus, which processes memory and regulates stress hormones. These changes disrupt core functions of our bodies and minds, As you grieve, you may find yourself sleeping too little or too much, forgetting things, or trapped in a brain fog. These feelings are difficult, but the acute pain doesn't last forever. Eventually, the sadness begins to lift at least a little bit, and then you may move on to feelings of anger or guilt before slowly moving toward acceptance of the loss. Experts agree the bereaved follow their own individual timelines, but in general, this 3-stage process usually takes about a year. There are steps you can take to feel better as you go through the grieving process. Talk therapy can be a major help. This might be group bereavement meetings or cognitive behavioral therapy, which can redirect negative thoughts. Aerobic exercise can improve mood, memory, and thought processing. Talking with friends about the person you lost can be a great comfort too. Studies show long-term grief actually activates neurons in the reward centers of the brain. And recalling the time spent with those who have died reminds us that the memories still live on. When we're grieving a profound
So, anybody want to react to that film? There was one part of it that I thought I had a reaction to. Anybody? So I bet all of you, and this is in the same category, I bet all of you have heard about the stages of grief that Kubler-Ross put out. Anybody want, can you name them? I bet we can name them.
Anybody want to jump in?
Denial,
Yeah,
anger,
Acceptance,
bargaining,
denial, anger, going downhill, bargaining, uphill, depression, and finally acceptance. And then she took a lot of flack for that, and so she modified it a little further and made it 7 stages, adding shock and the familiar others, and then adding testing and includes again with acceptance. And just like we discussed just now with the video, there are many problems with this stage-based theory about grief. And one of the biggest problems with this one is that she developed the theory on the basis of people who were dying, not people who were grieving. So, you know, grieving the death of a loved one is not the same as grieving our own imminent death. So she was in the wrong source in the first place. And on the basis of this stage theory, this is what you would expect. You would expect this thing of denial going down, getting worse and worse, depression, and then gradually coming up to acceptance. And this is what people were describing in the conversation earlier, is that you get to the end of a year and it, like Jean said, it's you're still, you realize that it's not going to end. There's no end to the grief. And I will say that the worst experience of grief I've had so far in my life, well, there are 2, but one was when my father died at the age of 47. He had an aneurysm in the stem of the brain. And even now, when I talk about my father, I get teary because that was just such an unanticipated death and experience. And it didn't end after a year. And then on the other side of this slide, you can see that this is kind of the road that people get. It's more like a spiral or an up and a down or a back and a forth. And I remember my mother, when my father died and she was adjusting to life as a young widow, she would say to me, you know, some days I think I'm good and I'm going to be fine now and I can carry on and I'm strong and I can do this. And then the next day I'm right back in the soup and I can't function. So I think that's more how it goes than any straight line or any straight stages. As many of you might have known, the late Rabbi Grolman, who was a Belmont rabbi, he said that grief is not a disorder, it's not a disease or a sign of weakness. It's an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. the price you pay for love. And then he says, the only cure for grief is to grieve. So, what does that mean? How do we grieve? What does it look like to just grieve? And there are people who have suggested that instead of stages, we think of tasks involved, like it's a project, to accept the reality of the loss. And I think that takes a long time to process the pain of the loss, and that too. And then to adjust to a world without the deceased. Someone whose husband died some years ago told me that everything changes. I was telling her that if my husband died, the first thing I would do is sell my house, because I can't, this is an old house and I don't think I can function in it without him. And she said, well, Jackie, you might want to think about that, because that's the only thing that doesn't change. Everything changes. And then the fourth task is to find a way to remember the deceased while getting on with the rest of your life. In fact, this might be another crazy idea for discussion, but some say we can learn from grief. And here again, I want to open up the floor and ask anybody to talk about what you might have learned from any grief experiences that you have had, or that are still teaching you. What are you still learning from grief that you could share tonight? I'll give you a minute to think about it. As Sam pointed out, there are different kinds of grief. Some grief is hidden away, and that makes healing more complicated. Sometimes this is called complicated grief or hidden grief, or another word for it is disenfranchised grief. This woman pictured here, Joelle Simone Anthony, is a licensed funeral director. And she says that disenfranchised grief is that nobody, that's not readily accepted or embraced by society. Individuals who experience loss on a consistent basis because of where they live, or the color of their skin, or because they are going through things that no one knows about. Disenfranchised grief is a kind of mourning that nobody talks about. Nobody sends you a casserole for, and nobody says, are you okay? And this can be very isolating and very hard grief to manage. The person who actually came up with that term is this man here, Dr. Kenneth Doka, and describes it as grief that's not openly acknowledged, socially supported, or publicly mourned. Since moving through grief does happen in community, when a person isn't accepted and their reason for grief is not acknowledged, it's harder for that person to heal, for them to get over that grief or get to a place where it's more manageable in their lives. And here are some of the kinds of things that are disenfranchised. Somebody already mentioned suicide, deaths among distant relationships under socially difficult circumstances, other losses that people seem are less worthy of grief. And there are non-death losses as well, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So here are some examples of those. The death of an ex-spouse or partner. A lot of people do mourn the death of a partner that's no longer with you, and yet nobody sees you as the mourner. Of an abuser, of a friend divorce is another kind of unrecognized kind of death. And then suicide, it was mentioned, addiction, capital punishment, elective abortion. And here's others. Infertility, miscarriage. I've heard women who've had miscarriages talk about that loss as being very painful and needing support that doesn't come because mostly people don't know about it. Loss of birth parents, loss of a professional life. I know when I got laid off from Radcliffe College when I was 55 years old, I felt like it was a death. And then there are other job losses, voluntary moving, dementia of a loved one, all kinds of things. There's another kind of grief too in communities. So for example, when one community is attacked, the grief isn't limited to the friends and family of that person who was attacked, but it also resounds within the community. However, grief on the community level is not always acknowledged or accepted as legitimate by society at large and may be ignored or minimized through gaslighting, minimization, and denial. And in fact, in 2019, this man, David Baker, and his colleagues published a research paper that was called Disenfranchised Grief and Families' Experiences of Death After Police Contact in the United States. And he interviewed 43 bereaved families of people that had been affected by deaths after police contact. And he said they are often unable to grieve in a way that's socially legitimized. And he also reported that disenfranchised grief has a racial dimension with regard to deaths having to do with police, with non-white families who may be deeply affected by it due to their position in society, the context in which their loved one died, and in terms of how the deceased was represented. And I think that's a very interesting idea that we've certainly been hearing a lot more about lately. Anybody want to talk about other kinds of disenfranchised grief? I think the one that Sam mentioned has to do with our son, which most of you know, has brain cancer, and we do walk around with that grief, even though he's still very much alive and doing very well. But it does feel sort of like a hidden grief that we carry around. Anybody else want to talk about a disenfranchised grief? So, with all this talk of grief, one thing we haven't talked about is how to support someone who's grieving. So, just quickly, and we don't have to be quick. We're going to go over some tips for how to respond to someone who's grieving in this little. It's a cutesy kind of video. I hope you don't feel it trivializes support. But I'm going to show it and then we can talk about it.
So what do we do about all the pain we see in the world? All the pain we feel in our own lives? And why does it seem like our best efforts to help somebody feel better always backfire? I've been studying intense grief and loss, baby death, violent crimes, accidents, suicides, and natural disasters. And I've learned something really interesting. Cheering people up, telling them to be strong and persevere, helping them move on, it doesn't actually work. It's kind of a puzzle. It seems counterintuitive, but the way to help someone feel better is to let them be in pain. This is true for those giant losses and the ordinary, everyday ones. Educator Parker Palmer writes, "The human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed exactly as it is." He's talking about acknowledgement here. Acknowledgement is this really amazing multi-tool. It makes things better even when they can't be made right. For example, somebody's struggling. Their baby died, or there's been a bad accident, or their mom got sick, and they're just sad. It's way more helpful to join them in their pain than it is to cheer them up. But here's what we tend to do instead. "You have 2 other children, you need to find joy in them." Or, "You know what you need? You just need to go out dancing and shake it off." Or, "I felt really sad once. Did you try acupuncture?" We're not really sure what to do with someone's pain, so we do what we've been taught. We look on the bright side. We try to make people feel better. We give them advice. It's not like this is nefarious. I mean, we try to cheer people up because we think that's our job. We're not supposed to let people stay sad. The problem is, you can't heal somebody's pain by trying to take it away from them. Now, acknowledgement does something different. When a giant hole opens up in someone's life, it's actually much more supportive to acknowledge that hole and let pain exist. It's actually a radical act to let things hurt. It goes against what we've been taught. In order to really support you, I have to acknowledge that things really are as bad as they feel to you. If I try to cheer you up, you end up defending yourself and your feelings. If I give you advice, you feel misunderstood instead of supported. And I don't get what I want either, because I wanted you to feel better. It's pretty rare that you could actually talk somebody out of their pain. Rarely does the admonishment to look on the bright side actually heal things for someone. It just makes them stop telling you about their pain. It's so tempting to try to make things better. When somebody shares something painful, it's much more helpful to say, "I'm sorry that's happening. Do you want to tell me about it?" To be able to say, "This hurts," without being talked out of it, that's what helps. Being heard helps. It seems too simple to be of use, but acknowledgement can be the best medicine we have. It makes things better, even when they can't be made right.
Okay. People want to react to that?
Done?
Well, I want to say thank you to everybody and show you
Everybody.
my beautiful gratitude slide. And then
Thank you, Jackie.
I want to tell you what's next. In about a month from now, we're going to have an in-person session after church on a Sunday. And this is going to be letting your wishes known part 2. As we talked earlier in the earlier series, we talked about letting your wishes be known about any treatments you want at the end of life or treatments you don't want, to let your family know what your expectations are. And in this session, we're going to try to let your families know what your wishes are about any memorial service, whether you want one or not, and if you do, what do you want to have in it. And I wanted to find it, but I couldn't. My mother left her wishes about her memorial service left to me in this piece of scrap paper, and it was like every time she went to a memorial service, she would scribble some other thing on it, and it kind of went around the page, and it was almost hard to decipher. So I'm hoping that you might want to do that a little differently, although it really was helpful to me when I was planning her memorial service. And we will also talk about what should go into your obituary. There were things that my mother told me needed to be put into hers that were things I didn't even know, like when she graduated from high school and the clubs and things that she was in. So it was really helpful to me to have that information. So we're going to spend a little bit of time after a church service on a Sunday and talk about what we want in terms of memorials and obituaries. So in closing tonight, there's no humor. I asked Lillian to read this poem by Denise Levertop. It's called Talking to Grief.
Thank you, Jackie.
Okay. Here we go. Ah, grief. I should not treat you like a homeless dog who comes to the back door for a crust, for a meatless bone. I should trust you. I should coax you into the house and give you your own corner, a worn mat to lie on, your own water dish. You think I don't know you've been living under my porch? You long for your real place to be readied before winter comes. You need your name, your collar and tag. You need the right to warn off intruders, to consider my house your own, and me your person, and yourself my own dog.
Everyone, and thank you so much, Lillian.